Although we are sharing this year's events virtually, the festival is based in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and we respectfully acknowledge the land on which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has been lost forever and can never be recovered. We also acknowledge the island of Uktahumguk, Newfoundland, as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq, and we acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Innu of Ntsinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatuhavut. We recognize all First Peoples who are here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As First Peoples have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the culture, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all.
Welcome to the St. John's International Women's Film Festival for our panel Outside the Box Creative Distribution, an age old burning question throughout the independent film industry. How do I get my film out there? I'm joined by some amazing people here to talk exactly about this today. And I'm going to read their bios and then we're going to start. So we have Angela Heck, the executive director of the Whistler Film Festival Society, who's responsible for the overall operations of the festival, including film and industry programming and a full slate of 11 talent programs. The festival recently celebrated its 20th year, so congrats. Prior to joining the festival, Angela served as executive director of Jazz Winnipeg, director of digital strategic initiatives at the National Screen Institute, and also worked at Winnipeg Art Gallery, Tactica Interactive, CBC Manitoba, Quest University Canada, and the National Film Board of Canada. Very impressive resume. And as a producer,
Thank you.
yeah, as a producer, Angela worked on the adventure realm with productions in the mountains of Tibet, British Columbia, and on the sea in Antarctica. Her first film, In the Shadow of the Chief, took home the People's Choice Award at the Whistler Film Festival in 2003. And she's a former board member of Dog BC and the University of Manitoba. Now, Shanda Shavanis. And I hope I'm pronouncing everything right because I am French, by the way. So if you hear an accent, that's where it's coming from. So Chanda is a Canadian documentary filmmaker, writer, and educator. She makes artful documentaries that amplify women's voices. Her award-winning films, Living Downstream and Unfractured, have been broadcast on 6 continents and have inspired tangible legislative and social change. She's driven by a belief in the power of documentary and passionate about demystifying production processes and building creative skills within the community through her work as a writer and educator. She regularly leads workshops for the Doc Institute and is an instructor in Centennial College's Film and Television Business Program. Her recent publications include Documentary Production in the Era of COVID-19, very timely, we're going to have to talk about that, Impact Investments for Impactful Films, and The Roadmap to Creative Distribution, which we're going to talk about. As a queer woman of color, Shanda's experiences have taught her that there are 2 things of which we need more: joy and justice. She hopes her work serves to bring both into the world. Orly Ravid. Born in Israel, raised in Manhattan, living in Los Angeles, Orly is the founder and co-executive director of the Film Collaborative. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing her on the podcast, Creative Distribution. She's also an attorney and the director of the Biederman Entertainment and Media Law Institute at Southwestern Law School. Orly has over 20 years of experience in independent film as an acquisitions and business affairs executive, and her experience encompasses all aspects of distribution, domestic and international sales, development, grassroots marketing, festival programming, you name it. She's also a regular panelist, educator, and blogger about digital distributing, splitting rights, and distribution in general at film festivals worldwide. And Orly has also contributed to IndieWire, Ted Hope's blog Truly Free Film, and the Film Collaborative's blog, of course. She's also an advisor on the Sundance's Artist Services. She co-authored the book series Selling Your Film Without Selling Your Soul, and recently contributed to How Not to Sign a Film Contract. Last but not least, Sarah Moses is the founder and CEO of Together Films, and I also had the pleasure of interviewing her on the podcast. Together Film is the leading social impact entertainment company in Europe. Sarah leads on strategy and fundraising for a variety of impact-driven media. And in 2020, she launched the Digital Perspectives webinar series discussing technology solutions during lockdown. It was very useful, I must say. She also co-hosts the Digital Power webinar series in partnership with the Center for Media and Social Impact, supported by the Perspective Fund. And she helped secure over £4 million in funding for production, marketing, and distribution in recent years. We're going to have to talk about that. Sarah was previously the partnerships manager for Doc Society, working on the Good Pitch initiative and setting up the Brit Doc film distribution division. Whoa, what a panel. So we're going to dive right in. And my name is Nora Poggi. I'm the host of the Creative Distribution 101 podcast. And as a filmmaker myself, having done the whole creative distribution with my film, She Started It, I know this is a lot of hard work. So we're going to start with the basics. Shanda, you worked on the roadmap to creative distribution, which is a great tool for filmmakers who are trying to learn about creative distribution. So can you summarize 40, 50 amazing pages into just kind of the nuts and bolts of what are we talking about here? And why is it so important to talk about it?
Sure. So the Roadmap to Creative Distribution was this guide that I wrote for documentary filmmakers. It was published by the Documentary Organization of Canada, which is Canada's only professional association for documentary filmmakers. And I've been a member for 20 years, so I like to advocate for DOC because they do amazing work and have amazing resources. But the reason that we decided to create the roadmap to creative distribution was that there were a lot of documentary filmmakers who wanted more information about how to do it right. And they were trying already to do creative distribution, but they weren't having the successes that they hoped to have. And so I think the first thing we need to do is just define what creative distribution is. So if you think about traditional distribution, which is selling all your rights to a distributor and having them sell your film to your audience. And then if we think of self-distribution, which is you packing your film into the back of your car and driving around and selling it directly to your audience. Creative distribution, I see it as being somewhere in between those two extremes. So you might have distributors sell to certain territories or certain rights, and then you take a lead on selling to audiences certain territories, certain rights. Peter Broderick coined the term hybrid distribution, and that's kind of creative distribution is the new word for hybrid. So it's producer-led distribution. You kind of figure out what works best for your film and then implement that rather than giving up all your rights at the beginning. And a lot of filmmakers engage in creative distribution because they think that it might bring them more money because they'll get all the revenues rather than splitting with the distributor. But a lot of filmmakers also engage in creative distribution because they feel they can control the distribution work, they can engage with their customers, and they can have real impact with their films. And so when we were doing our research, we found that a lot of filmmakers didn't feel that they had been monetarily successful, but they did feel that they had had great success in creating impact. And so with the guide, what I was interested in doing is helping them to amplify that impact, but also helping them to think through ways where they could actually make more money with their projects.
Amazing, thank you. Anybody can jump in at any point, but I want to point next to Sarah because you run a company, Together Films, that's focusing on campaigns. So what do you even start when someone is approaching you to work on a campaign? What should everybody start with?
Yeah, so kind of to follow on from what Tundra was saying, we see it as this balance between sort of the traditional kind of older models of distribution, sort of what the intention are of filmmakers moving forward, and this idea that we really want to lean into like what a producer or a filmmaker was hoping to see with their film. So if they have a project that was really exciting for like an educational market, like how is that going to roll out? What's that going to look like? If they have specific really direct local community kind of focuses they want to get to, like how are they going to reach into those different areas? So we try and look at it as this way of like bridging those two different conversations. So in the way that Sean just said, like you might have a traditional sales agent for one market or one region or one kind of territory, and then you're balancing that with maybe a theatrical booker, or maybe you have a theatrical distributor. It's sort of, we see everything like a jigsaw. So what are the pieces of distribution that you're excited about? What are the pieces of distribution that you don't care about? It's just sort of like, it's fine. If it does that, it's okay, but it's not where my heart is. What are those kind of bits for you that are most important? And we start by asking our filmmakers to put in a priority order. What is most important for you? Reach, revenue, reaction. And we see these as three distinct things. So some people come to us and say, I've got this project and I want everyone around the entire world to see it. And they're starting from this point of like reach. And you could say to that filmmaker, okay, well, if you put it on YouTube for free, technically everybody in the world could see it. Is that actually what you want? Like, break that down for me in more kind of metrics. And then we look at revenue. So a first priority is always, do you have any investment in your project? Do you have any person that you need to pay back from this project? Did you fund this completely from grants or from crowdfunding? Like, what is the actual financial model you're working under? And do you actually have like a recoupable financial target you're trying to make to? On the other hand, if you don't have investors, how much do you personally want to try and make out of this endeavor? Is it just to cover your time on making the film get out there? Or do you actually want to see like a profit on the back end, and what that might look like for you? And in the third case is this idea of reaction. So at Together Films, we really focus on social impact entertainment. So it's films about human rights, about women's rights, about climate change. But that reaction piece, we can also say to filmmakers around critical reaction. So we might plan a distribution rollout in a slightly different way. If maybe this is someone's kind of first feature, maybe they're looking for sort of validation and sort of continued career steps. So in that sense, we might say, okay, well, let's really look at your festival rollout first. Because if we want to kind of get your name known, maybe it's about plotting a festival roadmap that tries to get you some award-winning kind of positions or in front of the right industry targets, even if this film is not about making you loads and loads of money kind of down the line. So it's really about setting intention at the beginning of this process, because we have the flexibilities now with the way that you can divvy up your rights in different ways and engage different partners and different distributors to be working with you, that our first point of view is like, what is your intention? Why were you hoping to make this? What was the thing that you were hoping to see from that? And then let's construct a distribution path that makes sense, rather than saying, if you want your film distributed, just sign a single deal with someone and that will kind of help there. So in some cases with us, we may be the theatrical distributor, we might not be. We might be signing kind of all of your rights in a territory. We might be doing a few different rights. We might be working in collaboration with other distributors. So for our own practices, we look at every potential acquisition as either a collaboration with multiple other companies or freelancers or individuals, or that we're going to be managing the full part of a life cycle, if that makes sense for that particular film. So we always make sure that every film has this unique kind of path to it, and that we're not dictating a particular way of working on a filmmaker kind of when it comes through. And I think from our side of the world, where we're looking at this through a social impact lens, one of the priorities for us a lot of the time is we're speaking with funders who maybe have funded that film. So it might be coming from the Ford Foundation or MacArthur Foundation. And we're also asking them, like, when you put money into this film, when you granted this filmmaker some funding, what were you hoping to see from this? Because we also want to make sure that for the sustainability of the sector, if a funder contributed to that project, it needs to hit its results. Otherwise, that funder may in the future be like, oh, well, that isn't really working for us anymore. Like, they're not hitting what we hope to hit at that point. So one of the reasons we're kind of expanding next year to do further in the kind of sales market is that also that we can be that supportive bridge of acting as a sales agent on the sort of select number of titles we'll do in a year, so that we can really listen to those film investors and hear what they were hoping to see from that project and try and realize that. So if they had a really clear intention on, we gave you this grant funding for this human rights project to reach school audiences and educational settings, we build that in from the first moment of thinking about any contracts that are going out, to be respectful of that person's investment in that project and the reasons why they got involved. So it's, from an acquisitions point of view or from a planning point of view, it's much more of a nuanced, detailed process than just simply saying, I love your film, let's sign it tomorrow, let's go, which is what many other distributors over time just like so excited by the content, but they haven't maybe looked at the intention from the original producer or the original funder. And we try and get back to that source of intention.
I just want to say, I love what you're saying there, Sarah, about the intention is what drives the entire process from that point. And putting that, as you say, that puzzle piece together really has to start at a very early stage. So absolutely love what you're saying about that intent, and that needs to be primary. I'll wait my turn though.
No, that's great. Thank you, Angela. Anybody feel free to jump in anytime you have something to say. But I wanted to actually ask you and Orly about the festival aspect. How can festivals play a part in this process, from, you know, kickstarting a campaign to even sustaining it when you have, you know, maybe a year or more of screening fees and festival screening events and panels? And so can you talk about that? So Angela, maybe you can start with your experience at Whistler.
Sure. First of all, I'd love to acknowledge that the Whistler Film Festival is on the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish and the Lillooet First Nations. And particular poignant as we come from September 30th and onwards in the days of truth and reconciliation. So did want to acknowledge that. From the Whistler Film Festival perspective, I'm also coming at this from, as you read in my bio, a vast history of film, in particular on the promotions side. One of the things that we've discovered, and what the role of a film festival is really to be able to amplify the voices and the discoverability of the project. So understanding from a producer's or director's perspective where the film festival model fits in is really pivotal to success. What we did last year as a result of the reality of 2020 is that we went onto an entirely online festival experience. And we made the decision at that time to split the revenue with the filmmakers 50-50, which is a model that we're continuing this year as well. It was a very interesting, I would say at first, experiment for us. What it actually ended up doing in reality is that filmmakers who realized that this revenue split was possible to them actually doubled down on their own promotional efforts at the festival. So while we have a really amazing PR team already working with the festival, it did add an added incentive to the filmmakers to actively promote their own films, because they were directly benefiting from the box office that was generated through that. I should say it's not for everybody. There are so many different distribution models. It obviously works at different levels. But we also, if it wasn't directly with the filmmaker, we also did the split with the Canadian rights holders, which may have been a distributor. So it's a very specific example of how there are some models that are evolving in this whole new digital and technological landscape. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm from a country that does terrible things, so I won't have a beautiful message to say. But, I want to address actually a couple other points before we talk about festivals. Film Collaborators are a big fan of Together Films. And, and I appreciate that we're also acknowledging that some of the thoughts that we're articulating today have, evolved out of Peter Broderick and John Reese. He spoke of a hierarchy of needs, and I think that's worth looking at. And sometimes those needs are not the same. So it's interesting to hear the thought about the filmmaker and the funder. Well, even where a film doesn't have philanthropic funding, where there are certain goals on the part of the funder, sometimes the investors and the filmmaker have very different goals, right? There's a money goal for the investor and a career goal for the filmmaker. So it's a very important process to evaluate those needs. And then speaking of putting a film on YouTube, I'm involved with a film that every dollar of the $2.5 million budget is donated. There's not any financial need for the film. It's purely impact focused. However, even while the co-founder of Netflix said, you really want impact, put your film on YouTube. Well, sure, but people need to know it's there. And I think that's the everlasting challenge of independent cinema, because there's never been more to watch on the planet Earth than there is right now. Film Collaborative loves to work with film festivals. We have seen them as I'll get these questions of, when's the film going to be in distribution? It is in distribution when it's doing a festival distribution run, right? And now more than ever because of VOD. I love the Whistler model. We pride ourselves in working with filmmakers to both help strategize a good festival rollout that can be over the course of a year or two, and monetizing in the form of festival fees, and including rev share, which we also do with festivals somewhat regularly, actually. And what we, I mean, in terms of now, and folks are staying at home, and dealing with these new times. I mean, the festival release has essentially been like a virtual theatrical, and we have like a multi-part blog series on this subject in terms of navigating, these festivals sometimes are no longer just in their own city, right? They're in fact actually geo-blocked only to the United States, the entire United States of America, or the world it could be. And and then there's sort of issues around dealing with that in terms of not, for lack of a better word, cannibalizing other festival distribution opportunities. And then, when we do sales, which is very boutique, very rare, we then need to make sure, okay, we need to talk to the streaming platforms for whom that festival now essentially VOD, right, on demand distribution, it could be seen as competitive and could be problematic. So there's all that. So that's the complexity of today. But on the beautiful, the beauty is film has never been more accessible, and you've got closed captioning and audio descriptions, and the ability to eventize cinema in the most easy and low cost way ever. And and that's exciting, and that's a good thing. And in some ways, there's been more accessibility and marketing potential, where each festival event is its own little sort of mini hybrid theatrical event. And in other ways, it's been a little bit challenging because, for example, films that premiered in certain sections of even an A-list festival really could not pop because of the fact that there's just so much going on, and it's so much that's online. So, I think it's worth thinking through, but the creativity that's possible is tremendous, right? And essentially all of that kind of hybrid distribution, having impact and monetizing can be done together in the festival setting, where you can, have a discussion around the film and make money and bolster the career and, and do PR and sort of achieve all those goals all in one fell swoop. And I could keep going, but I'll pause.
Orly, I'd love to pick up on something that you said there about, possibly cannibalizing your different windows and opportunities. And I'd love to give a huge shout out to our programmers who are very cognizant of this and are really looking at putting the filmmaker first. What is it that will help achieve their success in the global marketplace, using the festival as a launch pad for that? And that extends across all of our relationships, whether it's with the streamers or other distributors, sales agents, but really ultimately it's to help drive that kind of discoverability and best path to success for the filmmakers. And I actually want to really give a shout out to the St. John's International Women's Film Festival, because there is also a bit of collaboration that does happen between some of our festivals that take this in mind. For example, last year, we were working with a group out of Newfoundland, where they ended up winning our top prize as Best Canadian Independent Feature and catapulting them to success. So shout out to Emily Bridger and her team for Little Orphans on that. But it's an example of how we can sometimes really put the filmmaker first and see where we can help amplify their success in this challenge of discoverability.
I think something that Orly just said as well, which is so important, is this idea when people say like, oh, you're not in distribution yet because you're just at festivals. Like, there's this really mad hierarchy of like what we deem to be a rights category that's more important than others. So Orly's probably heard it frequently as well, where we'll have filmmakers coming in being like, I'm so desperate for a theatrical release. And I'm like, okay, great. So it's the most expensive thing to do. It's really like, it takes so much effort. And then when you really break down to like, what is it you really want there? It's like, oh, I want to be qualified for the Academy, or I just want to like go to the cinema and see my name there. Okay, great. But it's not that actually you expect that your independent small documentary that was kind of like not in any major festival is going to reach millions of people. There's like this strange perception around what we deem to be good rights, bad rights, interesting rights. And we have this kind of hierarchical system in our brains that like theatrical, good, festival, different, non-theatrical, what's that? Like we have this like strange placement. But for me, it's like, as soon as somebody watches it, you're in distribution. Like as soon as that first thing happens, you're out in the world. You need to be aware of like, how are people reviewing your content? What's the feedback you're getting? Kind of where in the world are you seeing it? We'd seen some like mad examples of where some sales agents we'd seen like have festival requests from certain countries. And they're like, oh, no, we're not going to do that festival because we're trying to do something else in that country. I'm like, but there's a festival desperate to screen this film, and it's going to be like 300 people. Let them screen it. Like, if somebody wants to come in a year and go, great, we'll put you in cinemas, amazing at that point. But surely that one festival is not going to ruin the plan for that film in this way. So some of the sales agents, and I'll say in this in the kindest way, some of the older school sales agents still try and preface this really crazy hierarchy of like how we deem certain rights. But actually, if someone says to me, there's an audience group of potentially 200 humans in this country that want to see this film, I want to get them that film. I want to do everything I possibly can to make that happen, because it's an audience trying to pull that film into that country that maybe wouldn't have opportunities for other rights categorizations. But a sales agent might be like, oh no, let's hold off on that because I want to try something different. So I'd love anybody like listening to this today to really kind of think for yourself, like, what is it you want to see from your film? And if some of your partners are making those slightly crazy decisions, like, oh, I won't do that yet because we're waiting for this, sometimes it's logical, but sometimes it's ridiculous. And you need to be able to sort of know your own mind to sort of push back in some of those moments and say, actually, this may be the only opportunity for distribution in this entire country. And this particular example, I'm thinking of an Eastern European festival that got in touch about a project. There may not be any other distribution happening in that territory. If that festival gets in touch, do it. Go to that festival, make that happen, because it might be the only distribution you have there. So as soon as somebody is watching it, you are in distribution. And if your festival only gets a film festival release, you still had a release of your film. It still got to audiences, it got to be seen by people. So never do that.
And is that not even, I'm sorry to jump in, but you know, it's because there's so much sort of hegemonic, you know, old value value system that people have bought into and have not let go of. And I think we really need to change the language, because is a theatrical where no one shows up to the theaters, and that's even pre-COVID, better than a festival release where there's actual marketing and online and in person, you know, whatever. And you know, when the companies, the distributors, the sales agents really don't want to restrain you, it's also because they want to keep all the money. And so, right, they want to control everything and monetize themselves. And is it worth it, right? And I understand that the creative roadmap distribution is sort of looking at the combination of these models. And I think sometimes you just really have to ask yourself, is my film, does it even lend itself at all to any of this old world stuff? And then and I think we have to push back on the streaming platforms that would dare to not take a film because it's had some festival distribution that had an online component in a pandemic, where it's taking almost none of the independent films, right, period, that are available to it. And if it wants to take some, how could that possibly, you know, be an issue, right? Where it's got over 100 million subscribers or whatever the number is for the platform, right? How could these hundreds of thousands of people viewing it and these isolated incidences giving buzz to the film be an issue? It's unacceptable. And I think we have to change the language and the rules.
Absolutely. I want to jump into the next section, which is, you know, kind of the nuts and bolts. We're going to give some examples and we're going to talk about specific campaigns, but I want to start with the elephant in the room, which is how do we fund this work? So whether you want to hire, you know, a company like Together Films or work with the Film Collaborative, or if you want to do it yourself, but you need to eat, you know, and you're trying to distribute your film or create impact. Can you all, and this is for everybody here, talk about funding this type of work? Shanda, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. So when I was doing the research, and the roadmap came out in 2018, so it's not the newest document, but I still think it's one of the most comprehensive still. But what I did was I conducted a survey of documentary filmmakers to kind of learn what they were doing, what was working, what wasn't. And one thing that I heard was that lots of people were trying to do the work off the side of their desks. So they were interested in distributing their projects by themselves, but they didn't have any funding attached to it. And in fact, 45% of respondents made less than $10,000 from their self-distribution. So this is problematic, right? And so there is a section in the roadmap that's called Fill Your Tank, which is all about trying to raise money for the work before you actually start doing the work. And in Canada, there isn't much money for distribution that isn't targeted towards distributors. They get money, but it's really hard for filmmakers to get money. And I think that that's a systemic problem that we have in Canada, where most of the public funding agencies and the private funding agencies don't see filmmakers as possible distributors of their own work. So I think we need to change that, because we are doing a lot of the work. And then, but what there is available is there's funding for screening tours from a lot of the arts councils. There's funding for market development. There's funding for discoverability. So these are all things that you need to do as part of your creative distribution plan. And so by kind of conceiving of your project first and then looking for where you can get money, I think that that's the way forward. And the guide does offer kind of a comprehensive overview of the funding that was available at the time. So that is the approach that I would suggest people take. And there are also some case studies in the guide that tell stories of filmmakers who did things in different ways, including corporate sponsorship, impact funding, often from US foundations used to fund some of the distribution work. So there are possibilities, but we have to get creative with it. And Orly, I loved what you said about just how much creativity is possible. And that's one thing that I really try to encourage filmmakers to think of. You know, we're really creative in Canada with the way we raise money for our projects. We're really creative in the projects we make. We have to get more creative, I think, in the way we tackle distribution as well.
And for everybody here also, thank you, Shanda. What kind of budget are we talking about? Like, you know, there's a 6 months campaign, there's the 5-year campaign. I've worked on different types of films, but what should filmmakers expect to raise to do anything worth anything?
Unfortunately, that's the how long is a piece of string question. You do what you can under the circumstances. One of the best and most economical ways, I think, is to understand who your audience is that can support you right from the beginning of your journey, so that you can start to leverage your own community for your film. And that is eternal. I mean, that's a conversation we've been having for many years. But when you go in to start your creative vision, start thinking about who's going to see it and why they want to see it. And you can, use all of those tools on social media that are available to you. If you're doing this on a real shoestring, identify the key people on your team who are just really active out there and start to parse out some of those duties to them. And then you'll actually have a lot more control of your message as you go forward, and more people start to come on board as your project grows and develops, so that by the time you're at the distribution stage or you're looking for festival promotions and using those kinds of springboards to get your message out there, you're going to be very well positioned. There's so many tools. We had one filmmaker, Arnold Lim, last year, who basically rallied his community around his film and did so well with, he organized online viewing parties and just really was so active out there with that revenue model, him and, so many of our other, I'm just pulling him out of the mix as a case study, but there were so many others that really took such an active participatory role in their films that they did very well with that revenue split. So it's something that all the filmmakers have to be actively involved in. They can't just say, hey, here's my project. I've put my heart and soul into this. Now you go and distribute it. It really has to be that kind of a collaborative process.
Yeah. And I think if this is the idea of like reframing how we look at these budgets, like, so when you just said that, like we finish up our film and then we like hand it over to somebody, like I feel like we completely need to change the way that we look at this process across the board. So one of the things that we say in our office all the time is that a film doesn't exist until an audience has seen it. And like it's like a motto that I tell like all of our filmmakers, like a film doesn't exist in my mind until an audience has seen it. So you could have spent 20 years of your life filming this most epic thing. Until a single person sees it, in my mind, it doesn't exist. So you have to start thinking about your distribution and marketing with the same importance that you put on your story development, on hiring your crew, on thinking about your edit. It is as important, because until anybody sees it, it doesn't matter how epic your filmmaking was, it's never going to exist in the marketplace. And I have the same understanding for how we think about budgeting. So if we look at the studio model as an example, and there's many things about the studio model people hate, but they're really good at their marketing and distribution. And there's a reason why. During most of the greenlight processes for a film, not only are they assessing how much will we need to make this film, how much will we need to get that cast in, that amazing director, they are already planning at the greenlight process how much will we need to distribute this in the global marketplace? And when you look at the studio release budgets, they are spending 1/3 to 100% of a production budget on the marketing and distribution. 100% has got to be a James Bond, but usually most of the figures that get floated around is about 1/3 to 50% of the production budget in addition on marketing and distribution. So if you have a $10 million movie, they might spend between 3 and 5 million across all the different channels that they have to market that film. Whereas most of us on this call, we work in the documentary space. We sort of put all of our energy on raising money for a film and never think, I might need some money for the other stuff I need to do at some point. So I really want to kind of encourage all of us collectively as a sector to bring that back into our planning phase. As soon as you're planning out your production budget, have a distribution plan it kind of coming up. If you get that great call from Sundance, your film's in, you're going to screen here, immediately that is $10,000 you need to spend. You need a flight, you need a publicist, you need to eat. As soon as you get that great, amazing ticket to go into that festival, you have a bill that you're going to need to pay. So we need to build that into our development budgets. And the way that I suggest this in most of the films that we work with is I say, just start with 10%. If your budget is 50 grand, you're going to raise 5 grand for distribution marketing. If your budget is 2 million, you're raising 200 grand for distribution marketing. Whatever your production budget is, if it's nothing, then it's nothing. But like whatever you have, try and raise 10% in addition. And I question this to investors and funders at the point of production funding. So I've come into meetings with funders who are about to give some production funding to a project. And I say, thank you so much. That's amazing. I really, really value your time here. I'm so thankful you can come into this project. It's brilliant. Can I tempt you for an extra 10%? And we're going to put it in a pot and we're going to keep it separate. And at the point when the film comes out, we're going to need that money because we're going to need a DCP. We're going to need a poster. We need a publicist. We're going to need all these things that are nowhere most of the time in this production budget. Sometimes they say no. They have every right to say no. Sometimes they say yes. And then you start to build up this pot. And we've even started challenging that to some of the film funds. So there was a time when certain film funders wouldn't let you have any distribution or marketing costs in the production budget. So if you had national film funding from certain film agencies, you could not touch that for your distribution and marketing. And again, we'd go back and be like, well, what if no one sees this? You just invested X amount in this project that no one's going to see. Surely it's in your best interest as the funder of the film to help contribute towards the marketing and distribution. So we're not necessarily asking them to pay for everything, but we're asking them to allow a certain contribution of costs towards that. The other ways that kind of we have done this kind of in our minds is kind of the crowdfunding route and then the foundation route. So I was blessed to sort of like start out my career at Doc Society. They kind of do most of their work through kind of foundation sources. So I got very good at grant writing very early in my career. And it's a skill that if you're in the documentary landscape, you've got to be good at. There are a number of different foundations across the world. There are billions of dollars in those foundations. And when you're presenting to them in our aspect an impact campaign, we say to them, we're presenting you a comprehensive communications kind of plan. It's a film, it's webinars, it's Q&As, it's a screening tour, it's an educational project. You're not pitching them this film that you want to help out there. You're pitching them a comprehensive comms plan that will aim to achieve X for this issue. So as part of the funding route, we always say to people, it's about changing your frame of language and really speaking to how the funder can receive that information. Because if you just go in saying, my film's amazing, I'm a great director, they'll be like, who the hell are you? Go away. Like, it's not the way they speak. So you have to find this way of saying, I've got this incredibly valuable project here that is aiming to change the world on this particular issue. We would love to get your response and support on reaching out to different schools across the country, to doing amazing events in Parliament or at the White House. Like, tell them the story of all the things you want to do. Don't tell them the story of the film, because they can watch the film and they can say if they like it or not. What you're pitching for funding is the story of how this film will come out into the world. And whenever we're doing grant writing, grant support for people, it's the thing I'm having to edit the most. It's like, don't tell them the narrative, they can watch it. Tell them what you want to do with the money, because that's the most important thing.
Orly, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. I totally agree. And I mean, we've been talking, and I know before us others about, if you already raised all the money for your movie, you might as well raise, another, 10, 20, whatever percent. I totally believe it. I think it's really hard. I think people like what I see, and also as an entertainment lawyer, is not only they actually having to keep increasing the ceiling of their budget, and that is what gets challenging. But I totally agree. And even, by the way, for the films that go to Sundance, I mean, that's the thing is, again, it's that old model that we were formed over 10 years ago. We've been saying this for 10 years and we still have to say it every day. It's not quite sunk in that, most of you will not get those deals that you dreamed of. I'm sorry to tell you. And, the DPA, the Documentary Producers Alliance, has a guideline as far as producers paying themselves and getting your film distributed. And I love the work that Together Films is doing as far as also for the financiers and the funders to think about funding that way. In the film that I mentioned earlier, the $2.5 million, they've also gotten their distribution impact work money philanthropically, but there is definitely a sense of, oh, you should just be able to put it on Netflix and that should be all of it. Which, by the way, even if Netflix takes a movie, as we all know, they don't market all their movies the same way. And so your movie could and I've heard filmmakers complain, your movie could be there and nobody knows. So if you've made your film for impact reasons, if it's been funded with that as a goal, that's an issue. So I think it's great to start. And also, if you're an equity investor, I don't know, do you really want to have invested in a movie that never sees the light of day? Because you'll definitely not make your money back. That being said, you'll probably not make your money back anyway. I feel like film has never been sexier, for lack of a better word. So I'm not an expert in corporate support, but I know the creative distribution book covers some of that. And David Newman has done some of that, I think. I think it's an interesting time to also look to more sources of, for lack of a better word, free money that doesn't expect to be repaid. And that at least there, I mean, I know it's obviously, one has to be careful about whose money one takes and make sure the values are aligned and so on. But if it's sustainable, if it's safe, they have every interest in giving you money for your movie to be seen, because that's the whole point, right? They want the visibility, they want that association. So, Film Collaborative has a physical sponsorship program, and we definitely absolutely encourage support for distribution. And we have an impact video on demand initiative that is all about not money making, but rather raising money philanthropically to support the release of films being seen for free. Because also the other thing is, let's face it, most people in the world do not pay to see documentaries, period. And if they're going to see them at all, they'll see them on television or on the internet, where they don't have to pay extra, right? Either ad supported or subscription platform. So tell me if there's something else I was supposed to speak to, but I think that covers it.
No, yeah, I think this, yeah.
Sorry, I was just thinking one of the things that really strikes me is that as people are approaching this, it's also almost like an ages and stages kind of approach. Like, what's your longer term view, not only for the film, but for your own career? And what are you hoping to get out of it at that moment? But then think ahead, where do you want to be 5 years from now? So maybe your expectations for the film are just to get noticed in a particular community, that can get you to your next film. So that you're not looking for this one project to be the be all and end all for the project. I'm looking around this amazing panel, and I've encountered many of you or your names and bylines before, and I recognize that this is really a long-term career choice. And if you're in it for the long haul, there's a lot of runway ahead of you to build on.
So we're gonna move to the section about more examples and case studies, if you want to share some, success stories. But I do want to mention that one thing that is really important, and part of the reason why I started the podcast, is that we need to have those conversations to, as Sarah said, change the ecosystem. We can't just each in our own silos hope to get a 10%. We need to all create collective power. And that's why, Orly, you mentioned, the DPA, Documentary Producers Alliance. I'm French. We need unions. That's what we need. So think about that as you're talking to others. And also, one thing that was mentioned is philanthropic funds. The Tale of Film, which Sarah and I worked on, was funded production and impact through philanthropic funds, because, as Orly, you mentioned, some funders really want that impact piece, and they will finance a movie for that reason. So if you have a really comprehensive, amazing impact distribution plan, it can also help your production and getting money from the whole, for the whole package. One other thing I want to mention is that there's a lot of revenue to be made in speaking engagements, and that's a whole other conversations. But for my film with NCS Syed, we self-funded our campaign through speaking engagements ranging from 2 to 4K each. And I'm giving those numbers because we have to talk about them. Below $2,000, it was not worth it for us to travel. And every film is different, but that is literally how we finance our campaigns, because we never got the fledgling fund or all those grants. We self-funded. That doesn't take into account, a lot of the equity, sweat equity you're putting in, but it's an avenue. So I'm going to move on to the section of success stories, because even if it's hard, we need some hope. So who wants to start?
I wondered if I could pick up, oh, sorry, just a quick point on
Yes,
what you said, and then kind of go to you again, but just on this kind of corporate piece and the kind of brand involvement piece. So like, I don't know if anyone else in the room listening in, but there's a Roco Films, who are an amazing sales agency on the West Coast. But I got their newsletter last week, and it was that Google had come in to sponsor free educational access to one of their licensed property that they have. So essentially anyone could book a screening of that film for free, and Google were paying for it on behalf of audiences who wanted to see it. So I think a really exciting new chapter in the sort of social impact space that we're not really talking about enough at the moment is that, yes, if you're going to have someone fund the actual film, there's a lot of due diligence you need to go through in terms of what kind of brand partners. In some countries in Europe, you cannot have brand money in a production with a broadcast money because of the way that financing rules work here. But there are some incredible examples of brands supporting the distribution phase. And I can't remember the name of that film, but if you have a look on Roco's site, I'm sure it'll be there now in detail. But I was just like, that's really fascinating. They're like saying it, hey, we've got this corporate backing from Google. If you want to organize a license, just book it. It's complimentary, paid for by Google. So they're contributing those funds. But also we're seeing a massive rise with organizations like Storybolt, that are a US organization, doing screenings with corporates of a film. And we've been doing a lot of this over the last year, especially virtually, where we've been working with Facebook and Samsung and Microsoft and other organizations to host screenings at corporate offices, whether in person or virtual, and charging them a license fee for that particular screening event, and a speaking fee if the director is involved as well. And when Ollie was mentioning before about like the actual amount of money you might make from a theatrical, we've made sometimes more money from one corporate screening than potentially the net of an entire theatrical campaign. So this weight of like, where are films being shown and like what's the benefit to them? Also, that corporate, if we screen a particular film with their offices, they have the ability to like change policies, change rules, change the way a system can work. And we've made money from it. Whereas the stress and pressure of a theatrical for 3 months and coming back with like hardly any cash, but also maybe no one turned up or the result there is different. So again, it's this balance of like, where are those sources of funds? But I think the Google example with Roco was really interesting. We did the Patagonia campaigns for Europe for a number of years back on their environmental projects, and they have an incredible ethos and are an amazing brand to work with. And it wasn't just that they could pay for everything, which is amazing, but they had access. They have millions of followers on social media. When we said who wants to do a screening, they could put that out themselves. So I'm a big advocate, and in the European space, I'm like the bad person for saying like brands can be really good, but I really believe that there's a way as a sector we can engage and work with brands and corporates in a way that is mutually beneficial, that is not greenwashing, it is really working with them in a clever way. And also because we'll do a number of corporate screenings that we never publicize. So they're not doing it for the publicity, neither are we. They are doing it because they want to engage their corporate base and their employees to think more better about racial justice or environmental rights. And they're also paying for the privilege of doing that. But neither of us are actually doing it from a publicity point of view, because it's about internal change rather than external. And I'll happily take a corporate's money if they want to take that work and do it internally. There's nothing greenwashing about that. They want to do that work. They want to make that happen, and they're happy to pay for it. So people have a love-hate thing on brands. I'm a bit of a lover. I think we should do more with them. I think that's a better way.
Yeah,
Sorry,
you're gonna have to at some point do a separate talk about how to get those deals. I think a lot of filmmakers want to know.
Yeah, and Emily Best of Season Spark also provides that service. I mean, there's enough business for everybody, but it's not something we do at Film Collaborative. But I totally agree, and I think there's the right companies with the right reasons that it's worth absolutely exploring.
So who wants to start? Oh yeah, Orly, go ahead.
Well, I mean, let's see, a couple things. So first of all, I mean, there are a couple of different examples that are interesting. So we had one film that was marketing really to an Indian audience, both the diaspora and in India. I'm not going to name the name because I didn't get permission, but this was a bit, I mean, they were planned they had planned on having like they wanted the traditional theatrical, all that good stuff, and they had a big fabulous New York rollout premiere planned, and the pandemic hit literally right at that time, so nobody could fly anything. And what they did was they had that exact event, they recreated it with everyone dressed up for real and did a virtual red carpet event on Instagram Live. And for them it was a big success because all the same buzz occurred for the movie, and then it went on to do all this other stuff. Another example is a film that turned deleted scenes into NFTs, and people are talking about NFTs these days, non-fungible tokens. They made a bunch of extra money, which supported the release of their movie, and that effort in and of itself was a good branding lift. And then here's an example of film, I will disclose it, it's called Disclosure, film that premiered at Sundance, that we've been involved with, that for us is kind of like an archetype for reverse engineering your impact campaign. Because it's, while we advocate that you should really have a sort of release game plan even before your premiere. And I know, Sarah, you spoke about that, and we called it the collaborative releasing initiative. The notion being like, don't just be reactive to what comes at you, but have a game plan of what's the everything you could do everything you'd want to do if you could, and then see how you get there. Well, Disclosure got to Netflix, which is, I'm sure, something that they were happy about. But actually, that could have been a sort of dead in the water. But instead, what they did was they had a panel almost every week, right? That Netflix really supported, that was hosted by various queer, trans, and film organizations who we would ask subscribers to watch the movie on Netflix and then have impact around it. So there's an example of combining sort of, I guess Netflix would now be considered a more traditional type of distribution, right? A big traditional license for a number of years, where you're limited as to what you can do, but then making it work also from an impact perspective. So those are just 3 quick examples. I could go on, but I'll just stop talking.
Shanda, do you want to tell us about some of your stories?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of case studies in the roadmap, so folks can flip through and see different examples from all over Canada. One that sticks out in my mind is actually about theatrical release, and the roadmap does definitely make the point that theatrical release is not going to bring you a lot of money, and you have to really think carefully about why you want to do it. But in Canada, what happens often is our funding is broadcast triggered, so you sell to a broadcaster, and then that unleashes all of this other funding possibilities for you. So filmmakers will often sell their documentaries to a broadcaster for a license fee. The broadcaster also takes the VOD rights, but then you're left with all of these other rights that you can exploit, but not enough for a Canadian distributor to come in and pick it up for you unless they're really excited about your project. So there's a filmmaker named Joanne Jackson. She's the producer, and then the director was Sue Reinard on a film called The Messenger, which is about the decline of songbird populations. And they got some funding from the Ontario government, from Ontario Creates, to do a theatrical release for the film. It wasn't money for the release, but they were looking to fund feature films that would end up in theaters, but they had a traditional license fee from a broadcaster. And so they were unable to find a traditional distributor to take on the project. So because they had this clause that required them to do a theatrical release in Ontario, they had to carry one out themselves. But they did it, and they did it very strategically. So it was a limited theatrical release. They played for 3 weeks at a small cinema in Toronto, but they had theme nights, right? So they made it into an event. So they had a talk with their composer one night, and so music fans came, and they had branded coffee that they sold, bird-friendly coffee. So they were using these events to spark interest and engagement in certain populations, and then they booked theaters across Canada. And I think it played in like 20 some different theaters across Canada, pretty small country, but a good release. And they ended up making tens of thousands of dollars. So it's not a massive amount of money. But if your goal is to get your film across the country and to have people engage with it and engage with people, live when we're allowed to do that again. It was really successful, and it led to other deals. So they ended up securing a distributor in the US who took on the theatrical release there. And they got a pretty significant distribution advance from that as well. So it was a strategic decision that also had a ripple effect and got people talking about the film. It wasn't all about the money, and it was a lot of work, but they were really pleased with the results there.
Amazing. That's a great example. Angela?
I think, I don't want to get too specific on some of our success stories, except just to note that because we implemented the revenue share model last year and some filmmakers chose to come with us at that point, there was a recognition that there was an opportunity to help generate some revenue, but also by going with a festival that might not be one of the largest internationally renowned fests, they're also going to have a lot more access to discoverability and have that kind of opportunity. So, what I said earlier was really that we had some films that decided to come to the Whistler Film Festival last year, and hopefully again this year, that were really able to maximize that opportunity, not only to drive audiences to a platform where they actually had that opportunity to reach more audiences. Our online offerings are geo-blocked nationally to Canada, so it's a much wider audience than simply outside British Columbia. But they were able to work within the communities that they work with and to get the word out as well. So a lot of, like I said, online watch parties, a lot of social media outreach, getting the communities out there to help support the film actually netted some revenue for them and money in their pockets to be able to continue on their journey in a more effective way.
That's great.
Nora, can I just jump in and say one more thing? I think that these kind of big and impressive stories are exciting and useful, but a lot of filmmakers really can't put all of the effort and time into it that we might like to. And I think Sarah said at the beginning, this approach isn't for everyone. And I really believe that. So I just want to caution people, don't think that you have to do it all. You can do little bits and little pieces as well. So there's a filmmaker who's profiled in the guide from Nova Scotia, Sylvia Hamilton. She's kind of a legend in the documentary industry, and I'm sure lots of folks know her. And she made a film called Little Black Schoolhouse about racial segregation. And that film, she self-distributes herself because she felt like she could get more revenue than her distributor that she was working with. But it's very low tech, right? It's like people download the form, they fill it out, they mail it in, she sends them a DVD. It's just a little bit that she kind of does on the side when she can. But her sales have been steady. And they've been reaching people who are really interested in this film and this story. And so I just want to say that success is different for different people, and that there's a lot of opportunity to share your film in different ways, in whatever way makes the most sense for you.
There's also something to be said for serendipity, right? You don't know once you go out there what that journey is actually going to trigger. There was reference to my very first film, which we've completed in 2003, which actually premiered at the Whistler Film Festival. I can promise you at that point, I did not realize I would be sitting here as the executive director of the festival. Funny how things go full circle. That little film still keeps on ticking, even though it's in standard def 4:3. People are interested in the topic. We might see $5 a month, but it still keeps going. So that opportunity for the long tail still very much exists.
I think it's such an important point, and what we try and recommend to everybody is trying to automate as much as possible. So I love the idea that people are like printing off those forms and posting. There's something like nostalgic about that, but like people, virtual, electronic, please electronic. So like we're form obsessed. We have like a form for everything. So it's like, you want to work with us? There's a form. You want to book a screening? There's a form. You want to book a festival? There's a form. I know like all in the film collaborative team, you're great with your forms. Like we love forms. It just makes the world easier. So if you're thinking about doing this and you consider, and we haven't really opened as much the conversation around like what is like non-theatrical screenings, which I think we're all quite obsessed with, and a lot of the creative distribution thinking is around this, but we're talking like educational institutions, corporates, community groups. That is such a good money earner for such a long time. So if you can automate, like have it could be a Google form, really simple, nothing complicated. We have like more designed ones, but like a Google form is free. Have a form, it sends you an email, this person wants to screen it, put in the form, like what budget do you have? You're already prompting them to say. I think like film collabs one, you always say like, this is how much we want to charge you. Tell me why you can't pay this. I love that approach. That was a really good way of doing it. But like, what budget do you have? Do you want me to come and speak? Is there a speaker fee? Will you pay for lodging? Like put it really clearly in a form. And then when the form comes in, it's just really easy for them to say, yep, that sounds amazing. Here's my invoicing details. When you pay, I'll send you the materials. And with the kind of move to virtual now, you can automate that entire pipeline. So like with Roko's platform, you can buy the license online, you pick the price, same with like Women Make Movies, and all of you can build this into your website. So you have a website, you have a Shopify account or WooCommerce account, just say my license is $300 for universities, my license is $150 for this kind of group. Make it automated. And then as long as every now and then you put something on social media or you talk at a conference and you say, hey, come to my website and buy that license, you can just have this kind of revenue coming in an automated fashion. And I used to always to say to a lot of our projects, like, if you could just spend half an hour a week, just half an hour, emailing like 4 universities or reaching out to 3 community groups, just every week, Friday morning, send a few more emails. Not every single one will convert, but every now and then you'll get a few more. And it can just trickle in and be really aware and mindful of like topical moments. So we have a film about climate change in our slate, and the COP conference is coming up in November. And we booked thousands of pounds of licenses throughout August by just going out to everybody and being like, hey, FYI, COP's coming up. Do you want to screen this film? This film premiered at Berlinale 2.5 years ago. And we booked hundreds of licenses over it in the last couple of months. So be really mindful of like, when does your film become topical again? And to Angela's point, like, it doesn't matter how old your film is. It's irrelevant how the age of the film, is the film still important? And if it's still important, you can screen this for decades afterwards. You still have monetary value, which again completely contrasts with the notion of a theatrical where you only have value in like 4 weekends and then you disappear. So make the systems work for you so that you can keep generating that revenue without it being taxing on your time and energy. Just be very clear with people. How much budget do you have to do this? Great. Okay, wonderful. You've offered me $2,000. I'll take that. I would have taken 400 quid, but like, I'll take $2,000 instead. Like, you may even end up with more money than you thought when you just ask the question, like, what is your budget?
Well, and I think the work that you're describing, that kind of harvesting, I mean, there are plenty of films that stop having those transactions over time, but I think many documentaries that can remain relevant still can. But the work that you're describing is not work that traditional distributors do. After the first year, it's over. And I think that's the other pieces. And I think that's where filmmakers, that should just spend a few weeks researching a bit to sort of think through which films came before me that were similar, either, for one reason or another, or particularly where there's the same issues involved. What was their path? What worked for them? Read those related case studies. We have tons of case studies also on our website in Distropedia. They're not all applicable to every film, but right, it's like filmmakers kind of need to stop the willful blindness and do a little bit more reading and research to figure out exactly what they can be doing. And, in terms of these success stories, I think it's also important to remember that one person's success, I think you were getting at this, Shonda, is that Shonda, not everyone has the same vision of success. And for people who have simply had a nice life on the festival circuit and or found nice platforms to be on around the world, for VOD, and distributed direct to consumers, and had some interesting conversations with the communities around the world, or in the markets that make sense, in the countries that make sense, and maybe even did a little merchandising, like any of those things, especially in combination, is fabulous, right? And so that's something to be celebrated.
And I think there's also a pathway to mentorship here. This is not every individual doing this on their own every single time. There's a lot of people who have trod this path before, and there's opportunities to ask questions. And as you say, Orly, inform yourself, but don't be afraid of asking people who've done this before, even just for, some tangential advice. It all adds up in the cumulative effect to, improve your knowledge for all of this. It's a collaborative field, isn't it?
It is.
Royalty every time. I'm just kidding.
So because we're out of time, I do want to touch on the last, section in a conclusion type of way, because we could talk about this all day. And the end is really more about where we are at now post COVID. So if you can all kind of give your thoughts on some of the questions I asked were, what are the roles of film festivals now? And you touched on that a little bit earlier, right? With the virtual eventized rollout. And then, how can we have creative distribution be part of the ethics and accountability process of documentary filmmaking, which we're talking about now? But also, how has everything changed? So good luck, summarizing that in a conclusion way. But, if you have just a parting thought on that, where we are at now post-COVID, that would be great. And I do want to mention that everything we're talking about here will be, recorded. And again, go on everybody's website to make sure you learn about these things. What Sarah was mentioning, just the nuts and bolts. Shameless plug, I asked her on the podcast how to do these things, and same with Orly. So, the information is out there. So you can learn how to do it your way if you don't have, $200K to spend on a campaign.
I'll happily start by saying, I don't think that we're ever going to go back to the normal. And I also think the normal is falling apart anyway. So just as well. So I think the end of the day, festivals forever after will be be the new theatrical, and that theatrical needs to be reconfigured in people's brains in terms of prioritization, and that there should be concerted effort in the industry with the same ethos as behind the DPA and these other organizations of getting people who care about cinema, who want to bother to make it in the financing or producing way, to think about distribution as part of the plan. And and it's not the word creative distribution, actually, we shouldn't need it. It should be that we understand that this is the process. There's no point in making the movie if it's not seen. This is the majority of how to get it seen.
And I'm going to add a shameless plug. We did a research study on the future of festivals post-pandemic and the models that are emerging. And Orly, to your point, the distribution models that were quote unquote traditional, we're already seeing a lot of shift and change, and the pandemic has really just accelerated all of that. It's made us all a little bit more nimble. And I'm fond of saying something will happen. Who knows what? But I think it's just that accelerated change is what we'll be seeing. And that's as far as my crystal ball goes right now.
I don't know. I don't want to end on a downer note, but I do want to say that I think filmmakers need to think carefully about how to balance the workload that we're all undertaking. I think the pandemic has been a real mental health strain on a lot of us. And in working through this, the roadmap to creative distribution, I talked to a lot of folks who were really tired from the process of creative distribution. They weren't managing their time well, they were trying to do everything. And I think that the pandemic has really brought to the forefront the importance of really taking care of ourselves, really letting ourselves go at like a healthy rate. And I think in documentary, where kind of a lot of the work that we do is kind of secondarily traumatic as well. And so I'd just like to ask people to set really important goals and big goals for yourselves, and let your reach exceed your grasp always, but just be gentle with yourself in the process.
I think that's such an important point. And especially like me and Nora, we worked on The Tale together, and especially when you work on those films that are traumatic as a viewing experience and re-traumatizing for audiences, is such an important note to kind of be mindful of that with everything that we're doing. To bring it back into a happier kind of place, although that's such an important point, is like, I'm really excited about what we have coming forward. So like, I feel like there were so many things that were totally broken, including our mental health as a sector. Like that was one of the things that was really broken. And I think we're waking up to the fact that we need to be more kind of careful for ourselves, waking up to the fact that the kind of cookie cutter approach of like, you start in theaters and you open these 2 cities and then you go wider and you do things, like it just wasn't working for the majority of content in any way. So I feel really excited and kind of hopeful about the way that we're moving forward, and in the hope that each film now will find its own path and not be like embarrassed or freaked out that like, oh, I didn't do it that way. It's like, great, I'd love for you to do it in a unique way as it comes through. So really owning the fact that you have choices, that you have ownership of your own project. Like you can choose the way you want it to come out. You don't have to do what everybody else did before. And the thing that I try and tell myself more often as well is like, celebrate the small successes. So especially when you're in a campaign that's kind of growing, sometimes you forget to be like, oh my God, that screening we did last night was amazing. And like, there was 25 people there who were obsessed with what this film was about, and they had really great feedback. Like, when you're on that ride of your distribution, it's sometimes you forget to celebrate in the moment what you're doing really well. And it's only after like a year when you're really tired and you haven't had a holiday and you're like, oh God. So if you're in this process and you're going on this journey, especially as a filmmaker, try and take a beat to like celebrate the success every time it happens, because it will start to compound into like a really positive kind of feeling. Because you will never be complete. A campaign is never finished. A campaign is never completed. We might have a lovely, sexy timeline that says it's going to finish in 6 months. It doesn't finish in 6 months. It goes on for the rest of time. So you will never in yourself feel completed with the work that you're doing. So you have to take those moments to kind of celebrate yourself. And I think that plays into kind of the mental health conversation that we're having at the moment, that we need to embrace the fact that what we're doing is enough. And because you will never feel like you've done enough. So you have to be able to say to yourself, like, I've done enough at this point. And I say this to myself frequently, because I never take that enough into my own head, but like, you're doing enough, you're doing what you can. And ultimately also you're doing what your film is able to do. And you could have had a grand plan for doing 1,000 screenings, you're not doing 20, that's still better than nothing. So take the success in what you're doing, and take the fact that there are so many opportunities now to reach audiences in so many different ways, that your film will do what it needs to do. And when you feel like it's ready, you move on to the next one and kind of be done with it.
Love it. Thank you so much, everyone. I also love how everybody here is, talking about being realistic, because that's the biggest myth in this industry. Like everybody said, you can't do everything. So do a few things well, and that's already great, even though we're pushed to the brink of destruction with this competitive industry. So where can we all find you? We're going to finish on that. If anybody wants to contact you after hearing you speak.
Well, the filmcollaborative.org is the website with all of our educational resources, including case studies and the digital distribution guide, the distributor report card, and lots of other goodies, blog, information ritual, and all that. We're on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And I'm at Orly at the filmcollaborative.org. If you could spell it, you can find me.
And we're just at whistlerfilmfestival.com. We're coming up in December in person and online.
And we're togetherfilms.org. You can reach out at hello@togetherfilms.org if you want any further information.
For me, you can just Google Shanda plus filmmaker and you'll find me for the time being. But if you're looking for the Documentary Organization of Canada, who published the report, it's docorg.ca. And they also have free memberships right now for first-time BIPOC filmmakers. So I'd encourage you to join.
Thank you all so much, and good luck, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.